That way, hopefully, we can prevent it from happening in the future.
Has concluded in accordance with Standing Order 43. The time for members' statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is addressed to the Prime Minister. Is the reason his government won't commit to a bipartisan approach with Labor on the drought because he can't even manage a bipartisan approach with the National Party?
The Prime Minister has the call.
No.
The member for North Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister outline to the House how government services are being guaranteed for Australians through the Morrison government's elimination of the budget deficit? Is the Prime Minister aware of alternative approaches?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Throughout the course of this week and last, we have been noting how the stability and certainty of the approach that the government has taken, particularly to managing our budget, the government's budget, the budget we manage on behalf of the Australian people, the fact that we're able to keep our head, Mr Speaker, understand the challenges that are many and significant, whether they be global or they be domestic, and respond in a disciplined and in a targeted way, while maintaining the resilience that is necessary through our budget to meet challenges that we know will come in the future, continues to ensure that we can deliver the essential services that Australians rely on. The increase in funding and support for those dealing with mental health challenges in this country is something we outlined very clearly at the last budget and in the last election, and we are getting on with the job of delivering that support all around the country, whether it's what we're doing in Headspace or particularly in the area of dealing with eating disorders, Mr Speaker. We're increasing funding for farmers and for graziers, and particularly by 21 projects around the country that is dealing with resilience through the water infrastructure we're supporting, with some $1.5 billion directly being invested in those projects. We're providing world-class settlement services, Mr Speaker, as was recognised last night at the Migration Council dinner. These are the best settlement services of any in the world, Mr Speaker. They are the world leaders in settlement services, and our government continues to fund these important essential services by having a strong budget. Supporting first home buyers, Mr Speaker, through the First Home Super Saver scheme and the First Home Home Loan Deposit scheme. That's what a strong budget can do, to back the budgets of first home buyers, Mr Speaker, who are getting back into the market, and we welcome that. And we are maintaining our strong border protection regime, for which, as I know the Minister of Home Affairs knows, is well known. Is well known by the Australian people, the Australian government's strong border protection policies, and we are keeping our region safe and stable, Mr Speaker, through the investments we are making through our Pacific Step Up program to ensure that we are investing in their stability and prosperity and security for the future in front of the challenges they face. So we are not adopting the panicked and crisis policies of the Labor Party that they continue to urge us to do in this place, channeling their former compatriots in government under the Rod and Swan governments as they recklessly raided and destroyed the budget, Mr Speaker, recklessly taking away the resilience of Australians, Mr Speaker. We will not adopt Labor's policies of panic and crisis. Mr Speaker, we will continue the policies of stability and certainty that gives Australians confidence to plan for their future.
And I call the member for Hunter.
And I thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Regional Development. Does the Deputy Prime Minister endorse the drought plan leaked by the Nationals' backbench as government policy, a plan which includes regional funding?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Hunter for his question. Mr Speaker, the National Party always comes up with a range of policies because we care about regional people, we care about rural people, those who live in country and coastal remote Australia, and they're doing it tough at the moment. Regional people in those drought-stricken communities are doing it very tough at the moment, and that's why I'm delighted I'm part of a government which is helping them with changes to the farm household allowance, taking it from 3 years, which was what Labor's policy was, to 4 years in every 10.
Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
And that's why I thought it was my National Party colleagues cheering me on. And indeed, look at them, they are! The National Party coming up with the policies for rural and regional Australia. absolutely making sure that we're committed to helping those drought-stricken farmers. And it's all about, at the end of the day, it's all about delivery on the ground for those communities. It's not about who gets the credit in this place, it's about actual delivery on the ground. 122 councils receiving $1 million of support so that they can upgrade their Memorial Hall, so that they can, as I was the other day in Weddenshire at Grenfell, seeing new horse stables and new horse stalls built at the local showground to ensure that the local rugby field has got water. At the moment, the rugby field is as hard as this dispatch box, but next year, thanks to that $1 million drought community support program, it's going to be as green as the leather on the chairs that we're all sitting on, and that's a great thing. These drought-stricken communities want to see us talking about them, not about each other.
The member for Flynn has the call.
My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister inform the House how the Morrison-McCormick government's stable and certain budget allows us to build water infrastructure, particularly in my seat of Flynn? Is the Deputy Prime Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Flynn for his question, Mr Speaker. And I've just off the phone from Dr Anthony Lynham, the Water Minister in Queensland, talking about a range of infrastructure water projects in Queensland. And of course, in Queensland, the federal government has put $176.1 million on the table for Rookwood Weir in the member's electorate, and of course the member for Capricornia also has a great interest in this project. Also $47 million, including $5 million of enabling roads for the Emu Swamp Dam in the member for Maranoa's electorate, the Drought Minister, Mr Speaker. And I know this is going to help drought-proof Australia for the future. These dam projects, these water storage infrastructure projects are going to help build resilience. We're spending $1.5 billion on dams. That's right. We're going to build these dams. We're going to get on board with local communities. We've got the national water grid in place. We want to make sure that the states, to which I wrote last October, to see for them to bring their water priority projects forward. And we currently have 21 water infrastructure projects underway. Significant dam projects, weirs and pipelines to help drought-proof regional Australia. In the member for New England's electorate, of course, we've got Dungowan Dam. In my own electorate, of course, raising Wyangla Dam wall by 10 metres builds the capacity, and those two projects alone, Dungowan and Wyangla, indeed are going to provide an additional 1.2 Sydney Harbour equivalents in inland New South Wales. That is significant. That is delivery, and that's what we're doing. Now, Victoria brought forward its priority projects, and we're committed to them during the election campaign. Midiamo and District Reticulated Water Supply Project, $14.5 million. East Grampians and South West Loddon, rural water supply projects. They're significant too, $32 million and $20 million respectively. And last week, I was just this week, I should say, yesterday in fact, I was briefed on the idea to build the big Buffalo project near Myrtleford. And of course I had Peter Walsh, the Nationals leader, and his deputy, Steph Ryan, in my office. We were talking about that. Victorian Water Minister Lisa Neville, well, she doesn't want to build dams, unfortunately. She's reading too much from the playbook of her mate over there, the member for Melbourne, and thinking that climate change, it's not going to rain anymore. Well, indeed it will rain. In fact, when it rains, it's going to come in such volumes that we're going to need water storage capacity to help secure that water, to help store that water for the drought that's going to obviously happen after this one, because that's the story of Australia, droughts and flooding rains. And we are a government which is getting on board with building the dams that we need. And in South Australia, Premier Stephen Marshall, he's on board with us. Will Hodgman in Tasmania, they've built 16 of the last 20 Australian dams in that state, and well done to them. I was visiting Scottsdale the other day, and that is an example of what this government is actually doing.
The member for Hunter.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Who is running the government's chaotic drought response, the Prime Minister or the National Party backbench?
The Prime Minister has the call.
The Cabinet.
The member for Clark. The member for Clark has the call.
Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, the sickening revelations on the ABC last week exposed the vile treatment of horses in New South Wales and Queensland. And if it's happening in those two states, it's a safe bet it's happening elsewhere, including in Tasmania. Prime Minister, systemic animal cruelty is rampant in Australia, in horse racing, greyhound racing, live exports, puppy and kitten factories, and in the industrial production of animal-based food and textiles. Clearly, the states and territories cannot be trusted to regulate animal welfare, especially when they defer to industry self-regulation. Prime Minister, will you finally acknowledge the systemic failings in animal welfare in this country and establish a national independent office of animal welfare?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question, and I share with him, and I would be certain that all members of this House would share their deep concern at the images that were recently seen and screened. I found them very concerning and very disturbing, Mr Speaker, and I have no doubt that Australians across the country were equally disturbed. We are a country that cares for our animals, and in particular our farmers and those across our rural districts care deeply for their livestock and want to manage those issues in the best possible way. And so, Mr Speaker, the government, of course, will consider all its options in relation to dealing with these matters, and I'll ask the Minister representing the Minister for Agriculture to add further to the answer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Thank you, Prime Minister. And I do share the concern, the sadness and the anger that the member for Clark also has articulated. I don't think there's anyone in this place that would not agree that that's abhorrent. Can I say that we are working with the Queensland Government in a constructive way to make sure that action is taken and the assessment of that vision is undertaken as quickly as we possibly can. Any resources the Queensland Government requires, they will get. But we are confident in the ability of the Queensland Government to continue on with the processing of that vision. Can I just caution the member, however, in generalising the behaviour of industries? This has been something that is quite traumatic to many in those industries. The vast majority of participants in those industries find this abhorrent. It is against their morals and their culture, and they are hurting from this as well. We expect the states to live up to their responsibility as they have in managing animal welfare in this country. We don't need another layer of bureaucracy. We simply need the bureaucracy to do their job.
The member for Longman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House on the Morrison government's stable and certain budget management and record jobs growth? Is the Treasurer aware of any threats to Australians getting ahead?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Longman for his question and note his strong commitment to small business, having worked extensively in that sector, and the fact that in his electorate more than 60,000 taxpayers will get a tax cut as a result of the tax package that passed the parliament with the support of this side of the House, Mr Speaker. And more than 13,000 small businesses will be able to access the extended instant asset write-off which we announced in the budget of this year, Mr Speaker. Now, the Australian economy is in its 29th consecutive year of economic growth. We face some major challenges with the drought domestically and the global trade tensions, which are like a dark cloud over the global economy. But, Mr Speaker, we've maintained our AAA credit rating. We have brought welfare dependency down to a 30-year low, and we've delivered the first balanced budget in 11 years, Mr Speaker. A balanced budget and a surplus budget in 2019-2020, which will help build the resilience of the Australian economy, so that gives us the fiscal flexibility to respond to external shocks whenever they may occur, Mr Speaker. But the reason why our economy and the reason why our budget has remained strong is because of the employment growth, Mr Speaker. Over 300,000 jobs being created over the last year, Mr Speaker. A record number of Australians who are in work, a record number of women who are in work, Mr Speaker. And over the last 3 years, every single month, we have seen jobs growth. That is the first time that has occurred in recorded history, Mr Speaker, in terms of the Australian economy. And today there was a NAB small business survey, Mr Speaker, which looks at the business conditions for small business, which showed the biggest jump in small business conditions since 2013, Mr Speaker, for the September quarter. Now, Mr Speaker, I'm asked, are there any alternative approaches?
Members on my
member
left.
for Rankin, who we know likes to tax a lot, Mr Speaker, the member for Rankin, we know likes to tax a lot, sits by and smiles when Labor still has on its books $387 billion of higher taxes, Mr Speaker. $387 billion of higher taxes, a housing and a retirees tax, which he said he was proud and pleased of, Mr Speaker. Now, the Labor Party often describe the small business as the top end of town. Mr Speaker, the member for Rankin was the worst offender, more than 300 times, Mr Speaker, and we know they describe retirees, Mr Speaker, as receiving welfare for the wealthy. Well, the reality is, when the member for McMahon asked the people of Australia to vote against the Labor Party if they didn't like these policies, they took it literally, Mr Speaker.
The member for Rankin.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Is the real reason that the Treasurer always bangs on endlessly about Labor is because he wants to distract Australians from the fact he has presided over higher household debt and government debt than any other Treasurer in the history of this country?
The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, we're not going to take a lecture from the Labor Party that delivered $240 billion of accumulated deficits.
Members on my left.
And, Mr Speaker, do you remember the 4 budget surpluses that the member for Lilly, then the member for Lilly, Wayne Swan, announced tonight? Guess who wrote the speech? The member for Rankin, Mr Speaker. The member for Rankin, who we know likes to tax a lot. The reality is, Mr Speaker, we are paying back Labor's debt, Mr Speaker, and we are doing that by growing the economy. And what we will never do is whack the Australian people with $387 billion of higher
Member for Rankin. Member for Fisher.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Will the minister please outline to the House how the Morrison government's budget, its strong and stable and certain budget, is supporting Australians who are suffering from eating disorders and other mental health conditions?
The Minister for Health has the call.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. And I want to thank the member for Fisher for his passionate advocacy for those with eating disorders and other mental health challenges, as well as his support, along with the member for Fairfax and other members from Queensland, as well as across the House, for the Day for Daniel Walker and the emphasis on child safety. In terms of the ability to support patients with mental health challenges around the country, we know that it's absolutely critical that we have strong investment regime which provides for strong employment, which therefore gives us a strong and stable budget, which allows us to make these investments with certainty. And in particular, one of the areas which this government has focused on, and I want to acknowledge that the member for Fisher has been a leading national advocate in this space, is the support for patients with eating disorders. There are up to 1 million Australians who suffer from some form of eating disorder. Every person in this chamber will be associated with and will have been touched and involved in some way with patients facing the challenge of eating disorders. A little while ago, I had the pleasure of joining the member on the Sunshine Coast, where we were able to turn the first sod for the first residential eating disorder clinic to be supported by the government in Australia. But that will be the first of a network of residential eating disorder clinics with over $63 million invested around the country. And so that will help patients with options which have never previously been available. Whilst we were there, we met a young woman, Millie Thomas. Millie, at age 12, had the first signs of anorexia and battled for 15 years. And she told the story of how she had even been at the point of palliative care, and it had been that she had been taken to the Sunshine Coast for what her mother thought would be her last days, and through the care and the attention and the support of those around her, she was able to make the recovery. But one of the things that was evident is, as Millie said, the support was not there in terms of access to services. So as of 8 days from now, on the 1st of November, the Medicare benefit schedule will be changed and patients will be able to access 60 treatments and sessions for eating disorders. That will include 40 psychological sessions and 20 with dietitians, but it's part of a much broader national plan. The residential centres, the Medicare treatments, which will be available, as I say, on that scale for the first time, and the support for research, $5 million recently allocated to the University of Sydney and Deakin University. So, ultimately, all members of this House come together for support of patients with eating disorders, and we are changing lives, we are saving lives and we are protecting lives as a parliament.
I call the member for Bean.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Is the real reason the Prime Minister obsesses about Labor because he wants to distract Australians from the fact that net government debt has more than doubled on his watch?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Net debt under this government now is coming down because we're in surplus this year, Mr Speaker, and it's been a long time since we've been in surplus. It's been a long time since we've been in surplus, and after 6 painstaking years of getting the budget back into shape, getting spending under control, conservatively budgeting on the forecasts on revenue and ensuring we're getting Australians back into work so they're going off welfare and they're paying taxes, the budget is now in surplus this year, and that means that debt is now coming down. It'll fall, as the budget was saying, by some $50 billion over the forward estimates. I'll tell you why I talk about Labor, Mr Speaker, because I don't think we should ever return to the reckless policies of the Labor Party when it comes to budget and any other things, Mr Speaker. Australians know the mistakes that Labor made when they were last in power, and the reason we are talking about them again is because the Shadow Treasurer wants those policies reintroduced, Mr Speaker. In that wonderful book, which the Treasurer often quotes, Glory Days, Mr Speaker, he talked about the... He asked me about Labor.
The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Point of order, Mr Speaker. The question was about how on his watch debt has doubled.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. If that was all that was asked, the Leader of the Opposition would have a stronger case. But I've made the point about taglines, and when a tagline includes an entire political party and their policy approach, I think it does make the capacity for the answer pretty broad. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, so in glory days, the Shadow Treasurer was talking about his glory days as the Chief of Staff to Wayne Swan, and he said the Chief of Staff's job is tremendous and it's worth the greying hair and the expanding waistline. All at once you are the key advisor and confidant to the Treasurer. This requires a closeness with the boss and an ability to know his mind without even speaking with him about every issue. He was at one with Obi Swan, Mr Speaker. He was at one with Obi Swan, and he remains at one with Obi Swan, Mr Speaker, in this place. And as he listens to the Yoda of the time, Kevin Rudd, all he can hear is, higher taxes he must, higher taxes he must, Mr Speaker. I'll tell you why I talk about the Labor Party and fiscal restlessness is because on our watch we will put in place the stable and certain fiscal management, Mr Speaker. We will not return to the policies of panic and crisis of the Labor Party, which Wayne Swan and Kevin Rudd champion, Mr Speaker.
Members on both sides. The member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Housing and Assistant Treasurer. Will the Minister inform the House how the Morrison government's strong and stable budget is helping Australians get into their first home? Is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Housing and Assistant Treasurer.
Obi Swan. Give Obi Swan.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and can I particularly thank the member for Boothby for her question, because like the Prime Minister, the Treasurer and myself, the member for Boothby understands that we must be steadfast in providing certainty and stability to the Australian people by honouring our commitment to deliver a budget surplus and also to prudently manage the economy. Because, Mr Speaker, strong and stable budget management gives confidence to the economy more broadly. But as we have seen since the election, that gives confidence to the housing market. And most importantly, for the policies that we are progressing as a government, it gives confidence to those many hundreds of thousands of young Australians who are looking to get into the housing market. Mr Speaker, the alternative, though, if you don't manage a strong economy and if you don't prudently manage the budget, is you cannot do the things that this government is doing. And I was very pleased that last week we passed our signature policy that we took to the election, which was the first home loan deposit scheme. Mr Speaker, from the 1st of January, 10,000 Australians will be able to purchase a property with a deposit of as little as 5%. Mr Speaker, we know for first-home buyers, prospective first-home buyers, that saving that deposit is the hardest part. In Melbourne, it's taking up to 8 years to save a deposit. In Sydney, it's taking up to 10 years to save for that deposit. But when you manage a budget properly, you have the ability to fund programs like the First Home Loan Deposit Scheme. Now, that partly might explain why our other outstanding policy assisting first-home buyers, the First Home Super Saver Scheme, was so strongly opposed by those opposite. Can you believe that the Labor Party went to the election opposing a policy that gave a tax cut to first-home buyers? 5,000 first-home buyers have utilised the First Home Super Saver Scheme. The Leader of the Opposition says what? As if he's surprised. He doesn't even know what policies they took to the election. You voted against it. Don't you know what you voted against?
I just say to the Assistant Treasurer, I didn't vote against anything.
Sorry,
okay?
Mr Speaker, of course, the Leader of the Opposition is very confused about what he voted against. The First Home Super Saver Scheme has helped 5,000 first-home buyers to buy a new home. And now the First Home Loan Deposit Scheme is going to assist 10,000 new first-home buyers per year. That's what this government is doing. That's what a stable budget, prudent economic management can deliver, unlike those opposite who have opposed us every step of the way.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, and I refer to his comments in this parliament on Monday, when the Prime Minister told the House the following, and I quote, "Whether they're politicians, journalists, public officials, anyone, there is no one in this country who is above the law." End quote. Does he apply this standard to his own ministers?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, it's a fairly obvious answer to that question. No one is above the law in this country.
The member for Higgins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Immigration, Citizenship, Migrant Services and Multicultural Affairs. Will the minister outline to the House how the Morrison government's stable and certain budget is providing important settlement support to migrants moving to Australia? And is the minister aware of any risk associated with alternative policies?
The Minister for Immigration has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I do thank the member for Higgins for her question. And of course, Mr Speaker, stable and certain economic management allows the government to invest in our immigration program, including in our humanitarian program, which is an important part of our overall system. Now, Mr Speaker, in the year that just ended, we welcomed some 18,750 people to Australia under the Refugee and Humanitarian Program, one of the most generous programs in the world, and we focus on assisting people in the greatest need. And to that end, Mr Speaker, this year I have directed the department to increase the women at risk component of our humanitarian program to its highest ever level. 20% of the program will be reserved for women and children who are fleeing some of the world's most appalling situations. And we're also, in the humanitarian program, Mr Speaker, focusing on the government's overall objective in immigration of increasing regional migration. And so I'm very pleased to inform the House today, Mr Speaker, that in the year that just ended, we saw the highest ever proportion of Australia's refugee and humanitarian entrants settle in regional Australia, over 40%, Mr Speaker. And we'll also invest in settlement services, which helps new refugees and humanitarian entrants to become part of Australian life. That's in everyone's interest. It's in the interest of the people who arrive, and it's in the interest of the broader community. And there are lots of examples under settlement services. The Access Gateway program in Logan, which helps new entrants with access to employment programs, to English, to so many other areas of Australian life, and the Red Cross in Wagga, who are working closely with the Yazidi community in the Deputy Prime Minister's electorate, doing fantastic work, helping the Yazidi community with accommodation, with welcoming of kids to other kids in the area, and so many other important services. Right across the country there are churches, multicultural groups, community organisations, all participating in our orderly settlement services program. But I'm asked by the member, are there risks and are there alternative approaches? And there are, Mr Speaker, because we saw under the opposition the most catastrophic failure in Australia's post-war public policy history and its appalling loss of control of our borders. Now, we know the extraordinary economic cost of $17 billion and counting. We know that 17 detention centres were open. And most tragically, Mr Speaker, we know that 1,200 people lost their lives at sea. And we also know, Mr Speaker, that the special humanitarian program, which previously welcomed 5,000 people a year, was slashed to 500 people under Labor because they lost control of our borders. We run a stable budget and stable borders, unlike those opposite.
The member for Hindmarsh.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Emissions Reduction. Section 253 of the New South Wales Crimes Act creates a serious indictable offence for making a false document to influence the exercise of a public duty. I refer to his provision of a forged City of Sydney document to the Daily Telegraph in an attempt to influence the Lord Mayor of Sydney in the exercise of her public duty. Will the minister assure the House that this forgery was not made by him or his office?
The Minister has the call. The Minister for
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Reduction.
Yes.
The member for Fairfax.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And my question goes to the Minister for International Development and the Pacific. Will the minister outline to the House how the Morrison government's secure and stable economic management is making our region more stable and secure by assisting our Pacific family secure their own economic prosperity? And, Minister, do you know of any alternative approaches?
Members on my left, the Minister for International Development and the Pacific has the
It's
call.
nice to be popular, Mr Speaker. I want to thank the member for Fairfax for his question, and I note his strong advocacy of Australia's role in our region. Mr Speaker, with a strong and stable economy, we're obviously able to play a strong role in the Pacific, assisting our Pacific family, protecting their security, including their environmental and economic security, Mr Speaker. And it's the Morrison government that's concerned about enacting on the illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing activities in our region, which costs our Pacific family over $150 million every single year in stolen fish and lost economic opportunity. Of course, for the same reason, our government is working on tackling ocean plastics. This, combined with improved illegal fishing compliance activities, will see the fish stocks in the regions lift. As the Prime Minister has noted, and I think it's important for the House to remember, that without action, scientists tell us in the next 30 years the weight of plastics caught in our oceans will outweigh the number of fish in our oceans. And Australia, of course, is going to keep doing its bit to make sure the economic security of our region is secure. The landmark Pacific Maritime Security Program will see the construction of 21 Guardian-class patrol boats, 19 of which will be gifted to the Pacific and 2 to Timor-Leste between now and 2023. These patrol boats, built by Austal here in Western Australia, will have greater range, allow for them to be longer at sea and assist in the fight against illegal fishing, thereby aiding our economic security. Just this week, of course, as the Australian Defence Force completed Operation Solania. It's the latest mission to support the ongoing fight against illegal fishing in the southwest Pacific, with a focus on the exclusive economic zones of Solomon Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia and, of course, Palau. I want to thank all the ADF personnel, the DFAT staff who contributed to the great success of Operation Solania. And, Mr Speaker, our ongoing strong economy enables this significant support in the form of the patrol boat program to Pacific countries to help them tackle illegal fishing. And I'm asked by the member for Fairfax if there's any alternative policies and approach to the stable and certain budget management that we have. Well, Mr Speaker, the Morrison government will be delivering 57 new naval vessels in our time through our strong budget management. Of course, I've looked for another alternative policy to the commissioning of 57 new naval vessels. But of course, it's not 47, it's not 37, it's not 27 in the alternative policy from the opposition that we'll commission. It is, of course, and I say to the Leader of the Opposition, it isn't 7 vessels. I say to the Leader of the Opposition, you, in your 6 years in government, delivered no vessels, Mr Speaker. None. 57 vessels that will be commissioned by this government, 0 from the Leader of the Opposition. 0. Of course, Mr Speaker, it's strong economic management that enables the ability to build 57 vessels. It's strong economic management that restores the defence budget, allows us to secure the prosperity of our Pacific family and our region.
The member for Hindmarsh.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is again to the Minister for Emissions Reduction. I refer to the minister's previous answer. Where did the minister get the forged document?
The minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I absolutely reject the premise of the question and the bizarre assertions being peddled by those opposite.
The member for Mallee. Members on my left. The member for Shortland. The member for Mallee. That's the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Regional Services, Decentralisation and Local Government. Will the minister outline to the House how the Morrison-McCormack government's stable and certain budget management enables critical investment in regional Australia, including in telecommunications? And is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for Mallee for her question, and I acknowledge her strong advocacy on behalf of her constituents and in relation to the delivery of critical investment and services in her electorate of Mallee. In this context, I'm pleased to advise the House that a new mobile base station at Nullawil in the member for Mallee's electorate has recently been switched on under the government's mobile black spot program. Mr Speaker, the mobile black spot program is an excellent example of the record levels of investment we are making in regional Australia and a reflection of the improvements in services we are providing because of the strong, stable budget environment delivered by this government. A strong budget management, which has delivered a record of 36 consecutive months of jobs growth, underpins the investments that we are making in regional services through the government's $220 million Stronger Regional Digital Connectivity package. Through this package, the government is proud to be delivering improved mobile coverage and digital connectivity for more regional communities. The package includes $160 million for round 5s and round 6 of the highly successful mobile black spot program, taking the overall investment in this program to $380 million, and social benefit to the regional communities, including emergency service facilities, schools and tourist sites. So through this program, people living and working and travelling in the Nullawil area in the member for Mallee's electorate can now experience the real social, economic and safety benefits of improved mobile coverage that these new mobile base stations provide. The Nullawil base station will provide up to 100 square kilometres of new and improved 3G and 4G mobile coverage to the Nullawil township, and surrounding area, including over 20 kilometres of road coverage along the Calder Highway and adjoining roads, which obviously the member for Mallee would be very pleased about. Mr Speaker, our side of the House also recognises that regional communities are diverse and have different telecommunications needs. For this reason, the stronger digital connectivity package also includes $60 million for the new regional connectivity program. This program will provide improved access to digital technologies for Australians living in regional and remote areas. This means people will be better connected and have access to services like telehealth, and I know the member for Mallee is very passionate about the possibility of telehealth.
Member for Lyons.
We are working closely with local communities, industry and all levels of government to ensure the best possible design of the program. And I know the member for Mallee understands that the government's investments in infrastructure and services mean for the people of her electorate, whether it be addressing mobile black spots, funding key road corridors through the roads of strategic importance, or delivering more rural medical training places through the Murray-Narley Medical School. These initiatives certainly improve the capability and certainty of people living in regional Australia.
The member for Hindmarsh.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is again to the Minister for Emissions Reduction. And I refer to his previous answer. Where did the minister get the document?
The minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The document was drawn directly from the City of Sydney's website. It was publicly available.
Members on my left. The member for Canning.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Veterans and Defence Personnel. Next month, on November 11th—
The member for Canning will just pause for a second. Members on my left will cease interjecting. The member for McMahon in particular. Member for Canning can begin his question again. The clock will restart.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Veterans and Defence Personnel. Next month, on November 11th, Australia will mark Remembrance Day. Can the minister advise what this government is doing to recognise Australia's veterans both on Remembrance Day and throughout the year?
The Minister for Veterans Affairs and Defence Personnel.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member Canning for his question. And I think all in this place understand the nature of service. The reason we run for parliament in the first place is to serve our communities. And I guess the greatest risk we face is perhaps a paper cut or, Mr Speaker, a bruised ego from time to time. But for those of us who have actually served in uniform, like the member for Canning, we say to them, and those opposite as well who served, thank you for that service to our nation. And on Remembrance Day, Mr Speaker, Remembrance Day, November 11th, we recognise those who have provided the ultimate service to our country. And as a mark of respect throughout Australia, in our large cities, in our small country towns, we stop, we pause, we remember and we reflect on that service. And as a grateful nation, Mr Speaker, and as a mark of respect, we pause to remember and give thanks to those who have served in the past, but also those who are continuing to serve today. And we do have a lot to be thankful for in this nation. We have a great deal to be thankful for. The freedoms we enjoy today have come at a huge price. And the 102,000 Australian names on the Roll of Honour at the Australian War Memorial, the many thousands more who were injured in conflicts, and those who came back and carried those scars for life. We have a great deal to be thankful for as a nation. And this Remembrance Day, we particularly give thanks to all those who served in the past, but also to the families who supported them. And as a government, we are endeavouring, I must say, overwhelmingly with the support of those opposite, to improve the services we can provide to our veterans and their families throughout our nation, particularly our younger veterans on their transition, whether it be from peacekeeping missions or from deployment in conflict zones. We are working constructively, I think practically, and with the goodwill of those opposite, continuing to deliver better services, better facilities, better support for veterans and their families throughout our nation. So this Remembrance Day, Mr Speaker, we encourage the Australian nation to take the time to pause and to reflect on those who have gone before us, but also to spare a thought for those who are serving today. They can be injured in training, they can be injured during humanitarian missions, they can be injured during peacekeeping duty or on deployment throughout the world. So as we pause to reflect on the service of our forebears, I encourage each and every one of us to keep in our thoughts, to keep in our prayers those who continue to serve today. We say to them, thank you for your service, lest we forget.
The Leader of the Opposition, briefly on indulgence.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I associate Labor with the comments of the Minister for Veterans Affairs. Remembrance Day is indeed a very important day in our nation. I will be, I'm sure, with the Minister and I assume the Prime Minister at the National War Memorial on November 11, representing this side of politics, but wherever people commemorate our veterans, both past, present and indeed future, it is a significant day.
The member for Hindmarsh has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is again to the Minister for Emissions Reduction. I refer to his previous answer. Does the minister stand by his claim that he downloaded the document from the City of Sydney's website in light of information released today by the City that metadata logs prove conclusively that the original documents had not been altered since being uploaded to their website almost 12 months ago?
The Minister for Emissions Reduction.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As I say again, I'm advised that the document—
Members on my left.
The document was drawn—
The minister will pause. Member for McMahon is now warned. No, hang on. I'm just going to say to members on my left, I need to hear the answer. I've said it repeatedly. The minister, I couldn't hear the last sort of 10 seconds during the ruckus, so the minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As I say, the document was drawn from the City of Sydney website and it was publicly available. Now, I reject the bizarre suggestions and assertions being peddled by those opposite.
The member for Greenway. The member for Moncrieff has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Minister, what are the risks of alternative approaches to the Morrison government's well-known, stable and secure approach to border protection policies?
The Minister for Home Affairs, just before I call the Minister for Home Affairs, obviously I made my position clear yesterday on the content of answers, and I'm not in a position, obviously, to know what the minister's going to say, but I've got a fair idea. And I'm just going to say to the minister, the House of Representatives practice and the standing orders are very clear. I think the question is cleverly written and is in order, but it's the answer that I'll be focusing on, and I'm not going to allow questions. I'm just saying this, and I'm going to make this point about House of Reps practice. In fact, you might as well take a seat. I forgot to say. I'm just going to make this point. The standing orders make it clear that ministers can only be questioned about matters for which they're responsible, and I say in all seriousness the government is very keen to enforce that when it gets questions from the opposition about matters for which they're not responsible. The practice makes very clear that some speakers have had a very strict approach and indeed not even allowed taglines like alternative policies. I've been more liberal. I've been more liberal, but there has never been a time when an entire answer can be about an opposition's policy. I'm saying that, and because the policies the minister is responsible for are the government's. So the question is, as I said, cleverly written and in order, but for the minister to be in order in his answer, he needs to take the approach that I've been allowing. I'll let him have a go. The minister has the call.
I feel the weight of your expectation, Mr Speaker. Now, Mr Speaker, I'll make this very important point. The policies on border protection of the Morrison government are not only well known but well liked. Well liked by the Australian people, Mr Speaker, because they backed them again at the last election. I'll tell you what else is well known, Mr Speaker. The border protection policies of the Howard government, well known and well liked. And it's important to point out as part of this debate not only our position but the position of those opposite, because their policies on border protection, Mr Speaker, also well known not so well liked. Not so well liked, Mr Speaker. And the Australian public made a judgment about Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard that they were a disaster when it came to border protection policies. They put people on Manus and Nauru, people drowned at sea, kids were in detention. It was a huge failure. And the chaos was unbelievable, Mr Speaker. And it's strange that the Leader of the Opposition has continued exactly the same bad policy as that of Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard, and so you can understand it is not very well liked. Now, who, Mr Speaker, in this parliament would offer up policies that are not well liked and who KK is the answer, Mr Speaker, or Senator Keneally. Now, Senator Keneally has presided over policies not even known to many of those on the front bench.
The minister will resume his seat for a second. I'm just going to say to the minister, he has to relate his material to his responsibilities. That's what he needs to do. The question wasn't about whether anything was popular. The question was about risks to the government's current policies. And in order to do that, in the remaining time, he needs to at least outline what the policies are, if he's going to outline what the risks are. Otherwise, we'll move to the next question.
So, Mr Speaker, we stand for strong border protection policies. It is at the heart of the Morrison government. We have introduced laws that have kept our borders secure, stopped people smugglers in their tracks, but the threat has not gone away. And it's important, Mr Speaker, to understand that there are alternative approaches to that which we've presided over. And the alternative approach is the Medevac law introduced by Labor, which has sent a green light, Mr Speaker, to it was absolutely introduced and supported by you. The Leader of the Opposition says, I don't know anything about Medevac, Mr Speaker. That's what he interjects, Mr Speaker.
The minister will resume his seat. The member for McEwen, I just say to the Leader of the Opposition, if he's got a point of order, I'll hear it, but if he's wishing to answer something the minister said, no. I just ask the Leader of the Opposition to resume his seat for a second. If he's got a point of order, I'll hear it, but the point of order can't be he disagrees with something that the minister said. He can take that up at the end of question time, as he knows. So the minister has 27 seconds left. The minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, we know under the Medevac law that people are coming to Australia through a back door. We know, Mr Speaker, that people have come here not for medical needs, Mr Speaker. That is very clear because people have arrived and have refused medical attention. We know that of 135 people that have come, about 10% went into hospital. None of them are in hospital. Labor was all about bringing people in through the back door, as always.
Concluded. The member for Hindmarsh.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is again to the Minister for Emissions Reduction. Section 316 of the New South Wales Crimes Act creates an offence for failing to bring information about the commission of a forgery designed to influence a public duty to the attention of the New South Wales Police Force. Has the minister reported this matter to the New South Wales Police, or does he still seriously claim that the document he provided the Daily Telegraph is not a forgery? If he does make that claim, will he provide metadata to support it, as the City of Sydney has?
The members on my left. Can I just say to members on my left, when one of their colleagues has asked a question that I presume he wants answered, and they're preventing that happening. The Leader of the House on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And the standing orders with respect to Standing Order 100D, Roman 4, imputations. Now, the first question went to, and the subsequent question went to, the origins of a document. The minister has been absolutely straight in his answers with respect to the origins.
Members on my left.
It may not have been the answer that members opposite wanted, but the answer was provided. Now they ask a question which infers and imputes that an offence has been created, or indeed then ask the minister with respect to that which is not at all proven and not at all clear.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Speaker, the question—
Just say to the Leader of the Opposition, I can't listen to two people at once. The Manager of Opposition Business.
The question is effectively in three parts. The first describes an offence, the second asks whether the minister has reported it, and the third then asks situations whether the minister is in fact claiming this would happen, in which case an offence would not have been committed. So none of the imputations that the Leader of the House just referred to are made in the question.
And I thank the Manager of Opposition Business and the Leader of the House for that. I'm just going to make 2 points, really, without detaining the House for too long. On these sorts of issues, I've taken the approach of Speaker Andrew, which is if questions tend to contain accusations, by not allowing them, you don't allow the minister the opportunity, at least, to respond. To the Leader of the House, I'm glad he raised the point of order he did about a strict reading of the standing orders. As I've said before, if I was to apply that, that would change a lot of questions, but of course I would also be applying it to answers. So the House can perhaps reflect on that over the next 4 weeks. The Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I absolutely reject the premise of the question. Those opposite will believe anything they read on their favourite website, Mr Speaker. Now, the truth is that the member for Hindmarsh wants to distract from his woes, from the open hostility between his and his colleagues. They are all smear and no idea.
Members on my left, the member for Bennelong. Excellent. The
Thank you,
member for
Mr.
Bennelong
Speaker.
has the call.
My question is to the Attorney-General and Minister for Industrial Relations. Will the Attorney outline to the House how the Morrison government is creating stability and certainty in the building sector by cracking down on unlawful behaviour on building sites across Australia? And is the Attorney aware of any alternative policies?
The Attorney-General, Minister for Industrial Relations and Leader of the House.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Bennelong for his question. And of course, the member refers to the government policy being the Ensuring Integrity Bill, which establishes a fit and proper person test for holding public office in registered organisations, both employer and employee organisations. And why is that necessary? Because militant unions like the CFMEU have now racked up more than $16.7 million in fines, 2,190 incidents of law-breaking. That's just for industrial laws. And of course we heard that John Setka resigned from the Labor Party yesterday, not from the union movement, from the Labor Party. And the point about the necessity of this legislation is that whilst John Setka is clearly a problem, the problem is much bigger than John Setka. And of those $16.7 million worth of fines, 2,190 instances of breaking the law, John Setka is responsible for only 22 offences, or 1% of that law-breaking. And in fact, since January 2017, of the 80 CFMEU officials who've racked up 420 contraventions of industrial law, none of them have been John Setka. And I'm asked the question, Mr Speaker, by a tennis great who was ranked in 1975 at number 8 in the world. And the reality is, notwithstanding John Setka's amazing record of law-breaking, if he was in the Grand Slam of law-breaking on construction sites, he wouldn't even be a ranked player this year. Not even a ranked player this year, because everyone else in the CFMEU is doing an amazing job themselves at law-breaking. And I'm asked about alternative policies. The Labor alternative is to do nothing about out-of-control behaviour of unions and to oppose the legislative change that would do something about that. Why, Mr Speaker? Well, that might have something to do with the $14 million given to the ALP since the year 2000 by the CFMEU. But I wanted to just make some notes about the Leader of the Opposition's comments about this matter. And we know this week that the Leader of the Opposition has an unshakable, a watertight, a near fanatical commitment to straight answers. And he was asked this straight question the other night. It's not just him, Setka. Will the Labor Party keep taking money from that branch of the union, the CFMEU. Opposition Leader, the CFMEU is affiliated to the Labor Party. Lee Sales, so that is a yes, I take it. It's a pretty straight question. Will you keep taking their money with him as leader? Opposition Leader, well, they're affiliated to the Labor Party. Is it a yes or a no? Are you going to keep taking money from the CFMEU? A yes or a no? But it's okay, because we had the shadow AG come and clear it all up when he was asked the question by Hamish MacDonald. Clearly all those breaches that go down to the sector. Don't quibble. Will you take money from the CFMEU? Well, there are...
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. I seek leave to move the following motion. That the House 1 notes A. The Prime Minister's statement in the House on Monday this week that whether they're politicians, journalists, public officials, anyone, there is no one in this country who's above the law. B. The reported provision of a forged document to the Daily Telegraph by the Minister for Emissions Reduction in an attempt to influence the public duty of the Lord Mayor of Sydney. C. The creation and/or knowing use of a forged document in an attempt to influence public duty is a serious indictable offence under New South Wales law, punishable by up to 10 years in prison. D. The failure to report knowledge of a serious indictable offence is also an offence under New South Wales law, punishable by up to 2 years in prison. E. The Minister for Emissions Reduction has failed to explain his role in or knowledge of the creation and/or use of a forged document used in an attempt to influence the public duty of the Lord Mayor of Sydney. And F. The Minister has refused to give straight answers to simple questions about these crimes, as if the public has no right to know. And 2. Having regard to the foregoing, calls on the Prime Minister to ask the New South Wales Police to investigate whether the Minister for Emissions Reduction has committed a crime.
Is leave granted? The Leader of the House?
Leave is not granted.
Leave not. The Manager of Opposition Business.
I seek leave to move the following motion. I move that so much of the standing and sessional orders be suspended as would prevent the Manager of Opposition Business from moving the following motion immediately. That the House 1 notes A. The Prime Minister's statement in the House on Monday this week that whether they're politicians, journalists, public officials, anyone, there is no one in this country who is above the law. B. The reported provision of a forged document to the Daily Telegraph by the Minister for Emissions Reduction in an attempt to influence the public duty of the Lord Mayor of Sydney. C. The creation and/or knowing use of a forged document in an attempt to influence a public duty is a serious indictable offence under New South Wales law, punishable by up to 10 years in prison. D. The failure to report knowledge of a serious indictable offence is also an offence under New South Wales law, punishable by up to 2 years in prison. E. The Minister for Emissions Reduction has failed to explain his role in or knowledge of the creation and/or use of a forged document used in an attempt to influence the public duty of the Lord Mayor of Sydney. And F. The Minister has refused to give straight answers to simple questions about these crimes, as if the public has no right to know. And 2. Having regard to the foregoing, calls on the Prime Minister to ask the New South Wales Police to investigate whether or not the Minister for Emissions Reduction has committed a crime. We need to know whether the forgery was tailor-made, because it looks exactly like that.
Resume his seat. The Leader of the House has the call.
I move that the member no longer be heard.
The question is that the Manager of Opposition Business be no further heard. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 4 minutes. Lock the doors. The question is the Manager of Opposition Business be no further heard. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left. I appoint the honourable members for Gray and Nichols tell us for the ayes, the honourable members for Lawler and Werriwa tell us for the noes. Order. The result of the division is ayes 73, noes 66. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. Is the motion seconded? The member for Hindmarsh.
Seconded. The public has a right to know about these crimes,
the
not have debate shut down yet again.
The Leader of the House.
The member be no longer heard.
The Leader of the House has moved the member for Hindmarsh be no further heard. All those of that opinion say aye. Contrary, no. Let the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute. And I appoint the same tellers as the previous division. Members must remain in their seats unless they're leaving the chamber or did not vote in the previous division, or they're changing their vote, in which case they must report to the tellers. Lock the doors. The question is the member for Hindmarsh be no further heard. Members must remain in their seat unless they're changing their vote or did not vote in the previous division, in which case they must report to the tellers. Order. The result of the division is ayes 73, noes 66. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. The question now is that the motion moved by the Manager of Opposition Business be agreed to. And I call the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. The Deputy Leader will resume his seat. I call the Leader of the House.
Question be put.
The Leader of the House has moved that the question be put. All those of that opinion say aye. The contrary, no. If the ayes have it, division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute. And again, I appoint the same tellers as the previous division. Members must remain in their seats unless they're leaving the chamber or did not vote in the previous division, in which case they must report to the tellers. Lock the doors. The question is that the motion be put. Members must remain in their seats unless they're changing their vote or did not vote in the previous division, in which case they must report to the tellers. Order. The result of the division is ayes 73, noes 66. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. The question now is that the motion moved by the Manager of Opposition Business be agreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the noes have it. Division required. We'll ring the bells for 1 minute, but members just be mindful it's a 1 minute division if they can take their seats as quickly as possible. Just say for members, this is not a time for conversation. It's a 1 minute division. You need to take your seats. Lock the doors. The question is that the motion moved by the Manager of Opposition Business be agreed to. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left. I appoint the honourable members for Lawler and Werriwa tellers for the ayes, and the honourable members for Nichols and Gray tellers for the noes. Order. The result of the division is ayes 66, noes 73. The question is therefore resolved in the negative. Members could take their seats. I call the member for Herbert.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on how the Morrison government is continuing to implement its stable and certain plan to create a stronger economy and a secure future for all Australians? Is the Prime Minister aware of the impact of any alternatives to this plan?
The Prime Minister has a call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Herbert for his question and, of course, for his service. Earlier today, we awarded the first of the Defence Veterans pins, which are available to all veterans in Australia as a way of symbolising their service, and so that can also be very well known to others in the community. And there'll be many from this chamber, from both sides, including the member for Herbert, I know, who will be proud to wear that pin. And I say to all of those, and we've presented the first today, thank you for your service, and it's a great opportunity for Australians all around the country to say that same simple set of words, which I know is deeply appreciated by all veterans around the country. Now, as we came into this last sitting fortnight, Mr Speaker, over the last 2 weeks, we came in with a lot of work that had already been done by this parliament and the legislation which the government had been putting forward. Of course, we've been able to legislate the tax cuts, which we said we would do, Mr Speaker, at the election. We've been able to establish the Drought Future Fund. We've been able to keep terrorist foreign fighters from Australia, Mr Speaker, with new legislation to keep Australians safe. We're keeping the cashless debit card program running to protect more vulnerable Australians from social harm, bringing that legislation through the parliament, closing more tax loopholes, Mr Speaker, for foreign multinationals, protecting children from sexual exploitation and protecting the hard-earned retirement savings of millions of Australians from undue erosion through inappropriate insurance arrangements, Mr Speaker. And as we came into this fortnight, that is what we were doing, getting on with the job, providing that certain and stable leadership, putting the promises that we made at the election into legislative effect, keeping faith with those who showed trust in us at the last election. But over the past fortnight, Mr Speaker, we've continued that work, and I'm pleased that legislation has passed to establish the first home loan deposit scheme, that we've established the Emergency Response Fund, ensuring we are better prepared as a nation to respond to national disasters through a new $4 billion fund, Mr Speaker, which is providing the resilience that is needed in a country such as Australia's, which is used to having to deal with national disasters. We've ended the grandfathering of conflicted remuneration. So financial advisors must put the interests, Mr Speaker, of their customers first. We've given police new powers to prevent terror attacks at airports. Mr Speaker, we've established a new Veterans Covenant that acknowledges and thanks veterans, as I said, for their service and to acknowledge their families. And this week, through this House alone, through this House, we have ratified the government's free trade agreements with Peru, with Indonesia and with Hong Kong. We've provided for extra drought support for affected farmers with the Farm Household Allowance, and the Big Stick legislation has passed through this House, Mr Speaker. Some almost 50 bills going through this place since the last election, because we're a government, Mr Speaker, that is getting on with the job, serving the Australian people, putting those Australians first, staying focused on their needs. And on that note, Mr Speaker, I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper, and I also, Mr Speaker, present a revised ministry listing reflecting change representative arrangements with the other chamber that will take effect, Mr Speaker, from the next sitting period. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Thank the Prime Minister.